Okay, so where should we start? We can talk about how Elrond and Galadriel have basically had their roles swapped. In the books, it was Elrond who was more a leader of armies, and it was Galadriel who was more the politician, leader of nations, and both of them are essentially royalty in one way or another. But really, it's a lost cause. I mean, Rings of Power did not really make any honest attempt to make them like the characters in the books. In fact, they made some very intentional changes. But then why wouldn't they, right? That's kind of their whole point. Um, and I know they tried to justify it, say, "Oh, this is a younger Galadriel," and well, yes, yeah, sure, younger than she was in Lord of the Rings. But in the Second Age, the elves are they're immortal, so they've already been around for thousands of years. And Galadriel was one of the oldest of the elves. And she's literally older than the sun and moon. And, when they came over from the Undying Lands, she was already considered a lore master. She had studied at the feet of the gods themselves. That's something that I know it was Rings of Power kind of left out of the prologue. That land they came from when they sailed over to fight evil. That was the Undying Lands. That was the immortal realm. That was where the gods themselves were there in person. The elves kind of hung out with the gods. So we can get back to that in a minute. But the idea that the Second Age Galadriel was so young that inexperienced that she was just this brash, hot-headed, rude, emotionally immature warrior person is just no. It's got nothing to do with Tolkien's writings. At Second Age, by that time, they were younger than Lord of the Rings. That was a few thousand years later, but the elves were already thousands of years old. Already been through a lot. Should be very wise, mature, intelligent individuals. I don't know how many millennia does it take for an elf to catch up with emotional maturity of, I don't know, just a young human. And let's face it, the Rings of Power's portrayal of elves in general is basically on par with elves in modern pop culture. In Dungeons and Dragons, maybe, or some video games or whatnot, where elves are basically they're humans with pointy ears, and that's the only distinguishing feature. Pointy ears and maybe some special magic attributes, which Rings of Power hasn't really even shown us that yet. Beyond that, we got no reason to think they're any different than humans. Now, in the Peter Jackson films, we saw Legolas often exercise supernatural kind of feats of agility, and that was kind of cool. But Legolas is also one of the only elves in the main cast there. Well, he's the only elf we really saw in combat outside of some of the the prologue scene and whatnot. So we weren't really told, is Legolas super powered above all other elves, or is he like that because he's an elf? Now, in Tolkien's writings, there was no indication Legolas was a superhero beyond all other elves. He was just an elf. Now, in Rings of Power, we get this idea that Galadriel is, for some reason, superpowered beyond all the other elves. There's no explanation offered. She's just better at combat than all the other elves. In fact, all the other elves that we've seen so far in the show, they suck. They're terrible. They can't do anything. Because, again, there's nothing special about being an elf. There's no power or anything granted to them for being elves. The only elf that has any competency beyond human power so far is Galadriel. And again, she's basically a superhero. She's modeled more after something you'd see in Marvel or DC than she is anything you'd read from Tolkien. And that's fine if you admit that we're just writing fan fiction here, and this has got nothing to do with writings of Tolkien. And if they just kept the name Galadriel out of it, and just renamed this character to be anything else, then sure. I mean, there's nothing to complain about. We're just watching an original character set in the world of Middle-earth, and that could have been fun. It still wouldn't have been very Elven. I mean, the writers still don't grasp much of Tolkien's writings at all. They just like referencing it. But so let's get to the point. How did Tolkien write his elves? What was the point of Tolkien's elves? What were they really? Well, they were inspired in their origin by the actual concepts of elves from mythology. They were these mythical beings, these magical creatures that, kind of lived in the hidden realm, in secret places in the forest, and they, it was like a rare magical moment if you ever even saw one. At least that's how we're introduced to them in Lord of the Rings, where, of course, the main character is the hobbits who are just living normal, more mundane, non-magical lives, just going about their daily life. And the idea of elves is just this mystical thing. But now, as you go back into histories of Middle-earth, you get into stories from the Silmarillion, elves had a much larger role and they were everywhere. But see, that was how they were meant to be seen. They were myths, kind of mystical, mysterious in Lord of the Rings. But as you go into the past, there are these legendary creatures that had this huge impact on the world. And they're immortals, first of all. They're literally somewhere between humans and the angels. They had flesh and blood, they could be killed, and they had mortal physical constraints. Yet they were immortal. They would live forever unless they were killed. But many of them had been around since almost the beginning of time. Galadriel, for example, was one of the oldest elves. Been there since before the sun and moon even, and these characters are characters they're timeless. They're extremely... See, the expectation is that with age comes wisdom. And that was kind of what the elves were. They were in the know. They understood things that were beyond human understanding. And of course, how do you write characters that are supposed to be just so eternal and so wise and so mystical? Well, the first thing you do is you don't make them the main character. That's why hobbits were the main characters of, The Hobbit and of the Lord of the Rings. The primary books Tolkien published and was famous for, hobbits were the main characters. They were short people and they were different than humans, but the lifestyle of hobbits was just normal, mundane, farming, village life. So when they saw the elves, or even the humans and the kings and all these heroic characters, we saw all these characters from the eyes of humble hobbits. And that's how you write characters who are wiser than you. You don't put yourself in their shoes. You put yourself in the shoes of someone who's seen the wise person, And the elves are seen from the point of view of the hobbits. They are these mysterious people. They're wiser. They're ethereal. They have knowledge and composure and just emotional and mental maturity far beyond what even a human could expect to achieve. And of course, when you go into Silmarillion, where the elves are the more main characters, the Silmarillion is written in legendary fashion. It's written as a collection of legends and myths. They're kind of larger than life. Though it is important to note that even in the Silmarillion, no one was a superhero. The elves weren't going around with just magic powers winning the day everywhere. They had to fight and they had to struggle, and some of them were badasses in a sense. They were known to be warriors. But what you don't get is these stories of, and so, Gil-galad took on 100 orcs by himself because he was such a badass, and he took down... No, we don't have those stories. There are cases where big heroic battles took place. But again, the heroism was partly because they could still die. Fëanor is killed in a battle with Gothmog. Well, and that's just... He fought the Lord of the Balrogs, and he dies. Finrod, the actual Finrod from the story, not Rings of Power's little cheap version, he dies in a hand-to-hand combat with werewolves, Again, it was very brave and amazing that he fought the werewolves, and he actually won. He killed the wolf, but he also dies. They weren't these superheroes that could just solve anything. They still had limited capacity, and that limited capacity is part of what made them heroic, because they're trying their best to overcome obstacles. But the point is, in Silmarillion, they were legendary. And when we got to the more personal stories in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, they were mystical. And in every case, they are these wiser beings that are engaged in greater battles of good versus evil. And sure, they're not all perfectly good. They don't always do the right things, and there's various moral quandaries that they go through if you want to look at the stories in the Silmarillion. But if you want to compare Tolkien's characterizations of the elves to Rings of Power's characterization, in Rings of Power you get nothing ethereal, nothing wise about them, nothing feels immortal, nothing feels inhuman about them at all except for the ears. But at least in the case of Galadriel, you do get this superhero, just kick-ass, badass fighter routine that comes out of nowhere. But that's it. It's well known that Dungeons & Dragons was inspired by Lord of the Rings. But when it comes to Rings of Power, it's like they've just gone in reverse. Rings of Power is using Tolkien's name, but it's not inspired by Tolkien. It's inspired by Dungeons & Dragons. It's inspired by Game of Thrones. The things that Lord of the Rings inspired, and then Rings of Power like just going backwards and being inspired by those things. So we're not getting Tolkien. We're getting D&D players and LARPers referencing Lord of the Rings is what we're getting here. It's a one big Lord of the Rings LARP. But not even by someone who's even read the books or cares much about the books. They're too busy just telling their own story, which would be fine if they would just stick with telling their own story. But they, it's like when you got one of those really pretentious dungeon masters who just really, really thinks they're telling the next big epic tale, but they have no experience in story writing, They just think as long as they reference some other material, that then therefore whatever they're doing is awesome. That's what we're getting here. A bunch of cosplayers being, moved around by directors who think they're all that, and they barely even understand the works they're working with. They're not even fan fiction. They're fan fiction of fan fiction in a LARP. And that really is the heart of what's wrong with not just their portrayal of elves, but their understanding of Lord of the Rings as a whole. Rather than understanding the core idea and then building outward from there, they're working from these just surface layer of understanding and feeling as long as they wrap these labels and tropes around something, then that must mean what's on the inside is some deeper understanding, but that's just going backwards. This is just not how it works. This is just a very surface layer understanding, which is why they understand elves only skin deep, and when you go skin deep in elves, all you can find is pointy ears. And maybe the occasional cool action sequence or something, but that's all they can see. That's all they know how to explain. That's all they know how to write, because that's as far as I understand.